What did black families really make from leftovers in the 1960s? If you step back into those kitchens, the ones with linoleum floors and the hum of the icebox in the corner, you'd see a world built on resourcefulness. Nothing was ever wasted. Every scrap carried possibility. Leftovers weren't signs of shortage, they were proof of care. In homes where every dollar had a job, food had to serve more than once. Dinner on Sunday became lunch on Monday and often stretched until Tuesday. That's how flavor deepened, with time, with patience, with necessity. Here are 7 dishes that show what it meant to turn leftovers into love in the 1960s. 1. Fried cornbread mush. In the 1960s, if you grew up in a black household with a working stove and a mother who could make something out of air, you knew what fried cornmeal mush was. It started as leftover cornmeal, maybe from last night's pot of grits or the morning's cornbread batter. That pot would be scraped clean, the thick, grainy mush poured into an old loaf pan or bowl and set in the icebox overnight. By morning, it had set firm, holding its shape like pudding gone stiff. Mama would slice it into rectangles, dip each piece into hot bacon grease, and let it fry until the edges went golden and crisp, the inside soft like cornbread, and grits had a baby. The smell alone could pull a child from bed. That deep, nutty aroma of corn and salt meeting smoke. The kitchen always had that same hush in those moments. No television, no radio, just the sound of a fork scraping a plate. You'd eat it hot, sometimes drizzled with cane syrup, or topped with a spoonful of butter that melted into the cracks. Fried cornmeal mush wasn't glamorous, but it was survival disguised as breakfast. It was a promise that nothing would be wasted. Every grain of meal bought was stretched, repurposed, reborn. It reminded families that even when the money ran short, ingenuity would always fill the plate. 2. Collard green pot liquor soup. After Sunday dinner, the greens were gone, but the juice, that deep greenish-brown liquid left at the bottom of the pot, was where the real flavor lived. Folks called it pot liquor, and it was liquid gold in the Black South. You didn't pour that out. You saved it like it was medicine. The next day, that leftover pot liquor would go back on the stove with a handful of rice, maybe a piece of cornbread crumbled in, or even a few scraps of meat. As it simmered, the smell filled the house again. Smoky, salty, earthy, with a hint of vinegar if the greens had been seasoned right. It wasn't just soup, it was nutrition, made from what most folks would have thrown away. The broth held iron, vitamins, minerals, all the goodness leached from the greens. Older folks swore it could cure a cold or keep your strength up during hard times. In a decade when segregation and poverty were still pressing on the community, pot liquor soup was an act of defiance, saying, "We'll survive on what we've got, and we'll make it taste like heaven." One bowl could stretch a meal, fill a belly, and warm a soul. 3. Chicken neck and back stew. Whole chickens were a luxury, but the necks, backs, and wings, the parts nobody else wanted, were what most working families bought. They came cheap, sometimes in a brown paper bag, sometimes thrown in free if you knew the butcher. Mama would wash those pieces in salt water, season them heavy with black pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, then brown them in oil until they released that first puff of savory steam. In went onions, celery, maybe a stray carrot from the back of the icebox. Water followed, just enough to cover. Hours later, the meat fell from the bone and the broth had turned rich and thick, tinged with gold from the chicken fat. She'd pour it over rice or dumplings, and suddenly what started as scraps became Sunday-worthy. Those were the kinds of meals that taught you humility and resourcefulness. You learned that flavor didn't live in fancy cuts of meat. It lived in time, patience, and love. That stew was a working person's reminder. You didn't need much to eat like a king, just skill and heart. 4. Leftover biscuit bread pudding. There was never a house that didn't have a few day-old biscuits sitting forgotten in a tin or on the counter. Hard as rocks, but still full of possibility. You'd crumble them into a bowl, pour in milk, eggs, sugar, and a touch of nutmeg. If luck smiled, maybe a splash of vanilla or a spoon of fruit preserves got mixed in. The oven warmed the kitchen as that pudding baked, the smell floating through the air. Sweet, buttery, nostalgic. The top crusted over while the inside turned soft and custard-like. When it came out, you could drizzle it with syrup or condensed milk, or just eat it plain. Every bite tasted like home, the past baked into the present. It was a dessert born from necessity, but it carried tenderness. Every mother or grandmother who made biscuit pudding knew it wasn't just about feeding the stomach. It was about protecting the spirit from the cold reality of lack. 5. Pig ear sandwiches. You didn't waste a thing from the pig. Not a tail, not a foot, not an ear. Pig ear sandwiches were the ultimate working man's lunch, sold from diners, street corners, or made right in the kitchen after a big cook. The ears were boiled first, hours on low heat until tender, then fried in hot grease until they curled and popped. Some people threw in onions and vinegar, others added hot sauce and mustard for that sharp bite. When placed on white bread, the texture was something else. Chewy, crispy, slick with sauce. The flavor? Deep, smoky, rich with fat and spice. For factory workers and field hands, pig ear sandwiches were portable energy. Salty, greasy comfort wrapped up in foil. They carried the story of Black ingenuity, of turning what was discarded into something that could feed a family and make your mouth water at the same time. 6. Fried chicken backbones and gizzards. If you grew up in a black family during the 1960s, you knew the sacred sound of grease popping in a cast iron skillet. It meant somebody had found a way to make a feast out of scraps. Chicken backs, gizzards, and livers. Those were the cuts the butcher practically gave away. But in the right hands, they became something you could taste before you ever sat down. The backs were small but full of flavor, all skin and bone, fried to a dark golden brown so the edges crackled between your teeth. The gizzards were cleaned and soaked in buttermilk, then dredged in flour, seasoned heavy with salt, pepper, and cayenne. When they hit the oil, the whole kitchen filled with that familiar smell, the mix of meat, spice, and pride. Some folks ate them plain with hot sauce. Others tucked them into bread with a slice of tomato and mayonnaise. The texture was what you remembered most, that satisfying chew of something cooked just right, the crunch of seasoned crust, the heat that lingered. Nothing about it was wasteful. Every part of the chicken had purpose. In households that couldn't afford luxury, these little pieces of fried heaven reminded everyone that flavor was never about wealth. It was about care, patience, and tradition. 7. Red beans and rice with leftover ham hocks. Monday was wash day, and that meant beans simmering on the stove while clothes turned on the line. The rhythm of the day was slow. Steady work, steady cooking. And at the heart of that rhythm was red beans and rice, the classic dish built from whatever was left behind after Sunday's dinner. Ham hocks, once picked clean of most meat, went into the pot with dried red beans, onions, bell peppers, celery, and bay leaves, the kitchen filled with a scent so rich it made your stomach growl long before the beans were ready. As they softened, the broth thickened, taking on that smoky saltiness from the hocks. It wasn't a fast meal. It was one that demanded time, the kind you could only cook when you had the whole day to let the flavors come together. The beans weren't just food. They were comfort, stretched across generations. By the time the rice was spooned onto plates and the beans poured over top, what had started as scraps had turned into something that felt like celebration. Every bite was a small reminder that patience could turn poverty into abundance. Number 8. Turkey necks and rice. After Thanksgiving or Sunday dinner, turkey necks were never tossed out. They were too full of meat, too full of flavor. And when the week started, those necks often became the base for a dish that could feed everyone again. They'd go into a pot with onions, garlic, a splash of vinegar, and maybe some chicken stock if you had it. The smell hit you first, that deep, meaty aroma that filled the air long before the first bite. After hours of simmering, the necks turned tender, the meat sliding right off the bone. A few cups of rice went in, soaking up every drop of broth until it became something thicker than soup but lighter than stew. A meal that stuck to your ribs and stretched across 2 nights if needed. Turkey necks and rice weren't fancy, but they were full of care. They showed what happened when time met creativity, when what was left behind was transformed into something warm and sustaining. 9. Cabbage and cornmeal dumplings. Cabbage was one of those vegetables that seemed to live in every household. Cheap, filling, dependable. But the magic came when it met cornmeal dumplings, a dish built on the scraps of 2 worlds, leftover cabbage from supper and a bit of cornmeal from breakfast. The cabbage would go back in the skillet with onions and a little grease from bacon or sausage. You'd hear it hiss and pop as it softened, giving off that earthy sweetness. Then came the dumplings. Cornmeal mixed with a touch of flour and water, dropped in spoon by spoon until they puffed and floated. They soaked up the juices, the salt, the fat, the smoke. By the time it was done, you didn't care where the meal had come from. It was hearty, fragrant, alive. That was the secret of the era. Transformation. What was left in the pot could become something entirely new if you had the imagination to see it. 10. Fried rice with leftover vegetables. Long before takeout fried rice became common, black households had their own version, a skillet meal built from leftovers. Cold rice went into a hot pan, along with bits of vegetables from the week. Green beans, cabbage, onions, carrots, or peas. Maybe a piece of leftover sausage or a fried egg if you were lucky. Soy sauce wasn't common in every kitchen, so folks seasoned with what they had. Salt, pepper, maybe a little bacon grease, or bouillon cube for depth. The rice sizzled as it fried, each grain soaking up flavor until it turned brown brown and crisp at the edges. It was the kind of meal you could make in 10 minutes flat, yet it tasted like you'd spent all day cooking. It brought the family together in one pot, one skillet, everyone scraping their plate clean, no food left behind. That kind of dish taught you that flavor didn't depend on money or ingredients. It depended on memory, on knowing what worked, what felt like home, what turned scraps into sustenance. 11. Pig feet stew. If you ever stepped into a southern kitchen in the 1960s and smelled vinegar, pepper, and something faintly sweet simmering on the stove, you knew somebody was cooking pig feet. The sound of the pot bubbling was steady, almost musical, as the feet softened into tender, gelatinous pieces that fell apart when you touched them with a fork. Pig feet were cheap, almost given away, but they were never treated like scraps. They were cleaned, scrubbed, and boiled down with onions, garlic, and a splash of apple cider vinegar that cut through the richness. Some cooks added a pinch of sugar, others threw in a dried pepper or two to give it kick. The broth became thick and glossy, perfect for sopping up with cornbread. Kids might wrinkle their noses at first, but once they tasted that tangy, sticky sauce, they'd go quiet, just chewing, just nodding. This was food that took time, food that made you patient. It wasn't fast or easy, but it filled the house with warmth, with purpose. It reminded families that what others discarded could become a delicacy in the right hands. 12. Rice pudding from leftover rice. There were few things as comforting as the smell of rice pudding baking in the oven on a cool evening. It began with what was left in the pot, the leftover rice from dinner, still clumped together but too precious to throw away. You'd stir in milk, sugar, a bit of butter, and sometimes an egg if there was one to spare. A sprinkle of cinnamon or nutmeg transformed it, a scent that carried through the house like a whisper of sweetness. It baked until the edges browned, and the middle was soft, creamy, and warm. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't bakery perfect, but it was rich in a way that spoke to love, to mothers and grandmothers who refused to let a grain go to waste. That pudding wasn't just dessert, it was an act of preservation, not just of food, but of memory, of tenderness, of care. Each spoonful carried the quiet pride of turning leftover into something worth savoring. 13. Neckbone soup. If you've ever tasted neckbone soup, you know it's more than broth. It's a story told through smoke and salt. Back in the 1960s, when meat was expensive, neck bones were one of the few cuts people could buy in bulk without breaking the budget. They might not have looked like much, but the flavor they gave was unmatched. The bones were seared first in a little grease until they browned, then simmered for hours with onions, celery, carrots, and a few potatoes if you had them. The result was a broth so deep it clung to the spoon, with tender bits of meat that fell right off the bone. A bowl of that soup could stretch across days, first as a hearty dinner, then as breakfast with a piece of cornbread on the side. It filled the body and the spirit alike. Families didn't talk about nose-to-tail cooking back then. They just did it because waste wasn't an option, and flavor was everywhere if you knew how to look for it. 14. Cornbread and buttermilk bowl. Sometimes the simplest meals said the most. After a long day, when there wasn't much left in the pantry, someone might crumble a square of old cornbread into a bowl and pour cold buttermilk over it. That was supper. No frills, no fuss, just comfort in its purest form. The cornbread softened slowly, absorbing the tang of the buttermilk. Some people sprinkled sugar on top, others salt, depending on where they were raised. The spoon dipped in and came out heavy, the texture somewhere between pudding and porridge. To those who'd never tasted it, it might have looked strange, too humble to matter. But to those who grew up on it, it tasted like childhood, like hard times met with quiet resilience. It was food that reminded folks that satisfaction didn't need excess, that something small, made with love, could carry you through the night. 15. Catfish stew with cornmeal crust. Down in the South, catfish was the people's fish, caught in creeks, rivers, and muddy ponds. When there was leftover fried catfish from the weekend, nothing went to waste. The next day, those pieces might find new life in a thick stew, seasoned with onions, peppers, and tomatoes. The bones were picked clean, and the meat simmered with cornmeal to thicken the broth. What you ended up with was something between stew and gravy, hearty, smoky, and spiced just right. Some families poured it over rice, others ate it with biscuits, mopping up every drop. That cornmeal crust from the fried fish lent the stew a texture that couldn't be recreated any other way. It carried the story of two meals in one pot, yesterday's abundance transformed into today's comfort. It wasn't wasteful, it was wise. A reflection of the belief that nothing in a black kitchen was ever just leftovers. Everything had a second life, a second chance to bring people together around the table again. 16. Smothered leftover chicken over rice. Sunday's roast chicken often lasted well into Monday, and it never went to waste. The carcass, stripped of most meat, became the base for another meal. Every last bit was picked over and saved, the bones simmered in a pot with water, onions, garlic, and and a touch of seasoning until the broth was rich and aromatic. Once the broth was ready, the meat went back in, shredded and coated in gravy made from the drippings. Leftover rice sat waiting, steamed and fluffy, ready to soak up the essence of the chicken. The smell of the dish cooking again filled the house with warmth, with nostalgia. The chicken was tender and flavorful, infused with the richness of its original roasting and the slow magic of the simmering broth. Every bite carried the memory of the original meal, but elevated, richer, more comforting, more satisfying. And this was the essence of frugality turned into artistry, taking yesterday's meal and making it taste like something entirely new, yet familiar, proving that love and care could transform anything into sustenance. 17. Ham and potato casserole. Leftover ham was a treasure, and when paired with cold mashed potatoes from the night before, it became a casserole worthy of the table again. The ham was diced into small pieces, sometimes crisped slightly in a pan to release its smoky flavor. The mashed potatoes were mixed with milk, butter, and whatever seasonings were on hand. Black pepper, salt, maybe a sprinkle of paprika for color. Everything went into a baking dish and topped with a light dusting of breadcrumbs or cheese if available. The oven worked its magic, crisping the top while the inside remained creamy and rich. The smell that escaped the kitchen was intoxicating, buttery, smoky, and deeply nostalgic. This dish stretched across meals, sometimes serving lunch, dinner, and even breakfast the next day. It wasn't just about feeding the family. It was about pride. It was the ability to create abundance from what could have been discarded. 18. Bean and greens. Hash. Beans and greens were staples, but when leftovers stacked up, ingenuity took over. Collard greens, mustard greens, and leftover beans were chopped, mixed, and fried together in a hot skillet with a bit of fat, bacon grease if it was around, or oil if not. The sizzle was rhythmic, and the smell enveloped the kitchen. Earthy, smoky, sweet from the onions and greens. Some cooks added a dash of vinegar to brighten the flavor, or a pinch of sugar to balance the bitterness. Every spoonful contained a mosaic of textures: soft beans, slightly chewy greens, crunchy fried edges. It was a meal built on frugality and timing, yet it never tasted like leftovers. Each bite felt purposeful and comforting, a testament to generations who had learned to make something nourishing from minimal resources. 19. Leftover rice and beans with fried onion topping. Rice and beans might have been yesterday's dinner, but in black kitchens, nothing stayed the same for long. Leftover rice and beans were often reheated in a skillet with a splash of oil or butter, then topped with fried onions for texture and extra flavor. The onions browned and caramelized as the mixture cooked, adding sweetness and crunch. Hot sauce could be added if you wanted a punch, or just a sprinkle of black pepper. The heat of the skillet brought out the aroma of every ingredient, the smoky richness of the beans and rice combining with the bite of onions into something transformative. It was simple, yet profound. The meal didn't just fill the stomach, it carried history. Every plate told the story of resilience, creativity, and a refusal to let resources go to waste. 20. Sweet potato pie from leftover mash. No list would be complete without sweet potato pie, especially when the mash came from leftover baked or boiled sweet potatoes. After the holiday table was cleared, the remaining sweet potatoes were peeled, mashed, and blended with sugar, butter, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The filling went into a pastry shell, sometimes handmade, sometimes from store-bought dough, and baked until the top set with a gentle jiggle in the center. The smell of sweet potato, spice, and butter wafted through the home, and the golden crust gave way to a smooth, velvety center. Sweet potato pie was a crown jewel for the resourceful cook. Leftovers became something celebratory, rich enough to be a dessert and comforting enough to be a reward for hard work. Each slice carried sweetness, warmth, and memory, a quiet reminder that in these kitchens, nothing was ever wasted, and everything could be transformed into nourishment and joy. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to watch another fascinating video like this, click on one of the boxes on your screen right now.